brain names. One of the major differences we see is that here's the end of the brainstem. You kind of see the brainstem going this way along the back because they're walking on four legs, and ours is vertical, hanging straight down. Okay. So you'd see that you can kind of make out. Now we're looking at what is on top of the brain right here. This white sort of see-through stuff. What would we call this wrapping, this protective layer on the outside? No, that's wrapped bone. Periosteum would be right here if the skull was still there on top of this, but this is what? The connective tissue wrapping of the nervous system is what? You guys know this. I know you know this.
Nervous.
There's three layers to it.
Oh, the dura mater,
the arachnoid, the meninges, right? The meninges, okay? So it's this connective tissue wrapping, and we can kind of already make out some of the gyri of the cerebrum through this dura mater. So it's kind of thick, and what we're going to have to do first is remove the dura mater. I mean, it really is, the arachnoid matter is very, very thin. You can't really see it at all. I can't point to it. And the pia mater is right on the surface of the brain itself. Here's a little part sticking through, so that shiny stuff right on the surface would be the pia mater. But I'll cut away a little section first. So I want to show you a couple things about the dura mater. Now with the scissors, be careful. I know some of the scissors have two sharp ends as opposed to a blunt one, but you want to try to go in with a blunt edge because you could very easily damage the tissue. But I'm going to just get under there between the brain and the dura. You can see it's a pretty tough tissue. The scissor doesn't have much of a problem cutting it, but I'm cutting across. Now I'm coming towards the what do we call this? Longitudinal fissure, right? Separating the two hemispheres. I got to go a little bit deeper underneath, and then I'm going to come out on the other side and snip through there. And I'll just remove. Did he just pop in?
Yeah.
Yeah. Trust me, it's a good thing. We used to have. He would come at the beginning of lab, and you'd never see him again. If you needed something, you're on your own. Okay. Once again, I'm sure he's not feeling a thing here. But you can feel a little better about these. These guys are, they're at the slaughterhouse anyway. They're lamb chops at this point. Okay. So what I did here was just, you can see the dura mater, little piece of dura mater here. You can see now the surface of the brain, which is still going to have this pia mater on it, which is very delicate, almost like, remember the visceral, pleura and pericardium and so on, sitting right on the surface of the brain. So the pia mater basically just follows the gyri, goes into the sulci, and there's blood vessels in there, very, very thin membrane. The arachnoid mater, we're not really going to see, just know that it's there below the dura. It's a very tough material. That's where it gets its name, tough mother, right? It doesn't stretch. I'm trying to rip that. It's not ripping. It's not stretching. So it is very, very tough, very protective. Now, we'll notice a couple things we talked about in class, but notice how it thickens right here through the longitudinal fissure. Okay, it thickens because, remember, it separates into two layers. In the brain, the dura mater separates into two layers. We have the outer periosteal layer and the inner meningeal layer. And where they separate, they form a little space called the dural venous sinus in general. Specifically, this one is called the superior sagittal sinus. Kind of runs along the whole length of the brain between those two layers of the dura, and it contains what?
Cerebral.
That's what everybody says. Everybody gets it wrong. No, there's not CSF in there. CSF is in the ventricles and the subarachnoid space. This is in between the dura. This is blood. This is venous blood. Okay, this is where the CSF drains into, but there's blood flowing through there. Okay, so if I were to look here, you can, let me see, this one looks a little bit damaged, but there is a little hole right there, and I could follow it all the way through. There he is, but I broke through. It's going to continue all the way to the back through this venous sinus, sinus meaning space, venous meaning vein, like venous blood, not the planet Venus. But that is where blood flows. We call this the superior sagittal sinus. I may be able to get in this little triangular looking space here, right in there, inside the dura. This one's not a perfect one, but right in that space there. Okay, and you kind of see it on the cut view going there, but it's going to travel right along the top of the brain. Or you can see it in all the different views there. There's also, it's much more pronounced in the human, but below the that open sinus here, notice the dura mater continues down between the two hemispheres. It continues down. Here's where the hemisphere is removed. You see this? This is all dura mater. You can only see it. It only extends just a tiny bit on the sheep, not even much at all, down into that space. But it forms sort of like a little wall between the two hemispheres. And it's like, you know, it's not bone, it's not hard, but it's kind of a separator. It's kind of, it gives the brain some structure and separation. We call that the falx cerebri. It's on your sheets. The falx cerebri is this extension of the dura mater in the longitudinal fissure, okay, that separates them. Now we'll also be able to see, depending how this looks when I cut it, but there's also a sinus that runs here. The dura separates into the two layers here as well, between the cerebellum, which is going to be right under here, and the two cerebral hemispheres. We call this the transverse sinus. The transverse sinus. You can see it back here. This is a back view of the brain. See the superior sagittal one comes along the top of the head, and then you have the two transverse sinuses right here. And they meet right in the middle there. Then this is going to come around underneath, and then it's going to drain into the jugular veins and then come down through the neck. Okay. So we also have, there's a sinus between the cerebrum and cerebellum called the transverse sinus, and it also has an extension in here of dura mater that separates between the cerebellum and the cerebrum called the tentorum cerebelli. Okay, tentorum cerebelli, it's on your list. That is the meningeal, dural, I should say, separator between the cerebellum, which would be right here, and the cerebrum up here. Okay, so it's just below that transverse sinus. So what we're going to do is kind of try to remove this dura as best we can. I'll show you a couple of the features first. As we flip the brain over and look at the inferior side, we can see a couple of things. You know, this dura mater coming around. There's the pituitary gland. You can kind of see it sitting here. And a lot of this tissue we're going to remove. It's very, very difficult to remove this dura mater without removing the pituitary gland. So we're not even going to try. I did it on a couple last time, but you guys, you know, if it comes off, it comes off. We can also see these right here. What do you think these are?
Optical.
Good. Optic nerves, cranial nerve 1. Okay, these are going to continue to the eyes, to the retinas. So it brings sensory right from the eye this way. When I remove the dura, you'll see it a little better, but they cross right here, the optic chiasm. And we can tell now the pituitary, that right underneath this stuff is going to be the hypothalamus, because that's where the pituitary hangs from, and the optic chiasm is right in front of it. So I'm going to try to be careful. I'm going to try to cut the dura off. I'll show you in a moment how I can do that and keep the optic nerves. These are those olfactory bulbs right here. You can see how much bigger they are in the sheep compared to the ones on the human brain. They don't really even get that much bigger over here at all. Okay? Because they rely on their noses much more than we do. And then we'll be able to see under the dura, you can see the actual tract go back to the temporal lobe. Okay, we'll take that off. All right, so how I would do this is, just to give you an idea, when we cut back towards again, I'm going to come in on an angle so I don't damage the tissue. I'm going to come back towards that transverse sinus right here. Now, it's a lot thicker there than it is over here. So I have to be a little careful here. I kind of go in and I go real deep underneath and come back out, and I can snip like that. Okay? And I probably still didn't completely cut it, but I can go in between the two and snip. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Again, come in at an angle. If you want to, look around and see if you can find a blunt scissor, if yours and your kit is sharp, and you can borrow from somebody. Okay, I'm going to go under, scoop it up, and snip. I'm not so worried about the cerebellum. I don't want to damage the cerebrum if I can avoid it. But when I do that, I should be able to pull that out most of the way. You'll see some things, a little bit of adherence there. Okay. Now, when we come to the bottom, again, there's usually little openings where the olfactory bulbs show through. That usually comes up. You may just want to make a little, actually this whole thing should just come off. Let me get the tweezer right here. Help me a little bit. Okay. Peel it back this way. Now, if I just peeled, I'd probably rip off the whole optic chiasm and the whole thing right there. So I'm going to remove some other pieces first, just to make it a little bit easier to handle. So I'll cut off all this dura. We're going to get rid of most of this dura. I kept a couple of samples just to show that dural venous sinus. But yeah, I'll show you how we would do this. I cut through here towards that optic chiasm, but I'm going to get underneath here. I'm not going to go all the way underneath. I'm going to, just so I can see the scissor there, and cut just like that. And now, you know, if I wanted to, I could spend a lot of time trying to remove this without the pituitary coming off, but it's pretty tough to do. You know, you can cut away some of this material. So I'll show you one other thing here. Okay. Let me do this so you guys can get started. These are from last week, and I'll just show you a couple. Last week's stew. Let's see. We should have one that was still intact. Okay. So this is one that I see the chiasm got a little bit damaged there, the optic nerves. But you can see here, by removing all the dura, I left some here so you can see, once again, this one's a little bit easier to see, that sinus, dural venous sinus right in there, superior sagittal sinus. Okay, you can actually see the transverse sinus going in there through that opening. In here, transverse sinus. Okay, and when you flip over, you can see the optic nerves, the optic chiasm. There's still a little dura on there, but that's where they cross. Then they become optic tracts as they go back into the brain. Can you see the olfactory tract now? There's the bulb. You see that? That's the olfactory nerve going back to the temporal lobe there. Here's that pituitary. It's just sort of hanging there. It hangs by a stalk called an infundibulum. It's on your list. But if we just had a brain with that removed, and I just point to that area, you know, it's right here, I could just say, okay, what attaches right here? You know, the pituitary gland, you would say. So that's right where that sella turcica of the brain is, the skull. The sphenoid bone sits right here. That sits right inside, just behind the optic chiasm. And you can actually see here, so there's cranial nerve 1, right? I mean cranial nerve 1, cranial nerve 2. These are actually cranial nerve 3. What's cranial nerve 3? Oculomotor. Okay, so those are going to go to the eye muscles also, the eye. So this is really that hypothalamus, just underneath that pituitary. It's that little stalk there. I know it's hard to see, but let's see if I can show you guys. The little stalk. Infundibulum. Okay, so this little area behind the chiasm and where this attaches, and this little area, that's it, is the hypothalamus. We're going to see more of it from the midline, but that's the mammillary bodies right here. Okay, it actually just looks like one structure, whereas in the human, you got these two bulges right there, mammillary bodies. But they're bigger in humans than they are in the sheep. Okay, I guess sheep don't have good memories. But then you can see this little bulge, this first bulge of the brainstem, pons. This is the medulla right here. And then where it gets real thin, that's the spinal cord starting right there. Okay, pons, medulla, spinal cord. And then you can see in the back, the cerebellum is underneath this dura mater here. I just left it intact on this one, but that's all cerebellum. Okay, so we can do that first. Everybody from each table, you know, come up. We'll grab a tray from right over here. The dissection kits and gloves are over there. I'll give you one of these to start working on. We'll do the external anatomy, and then we'll cut them in half like we saw here, and we'll look at all the structures on the midline. Okay?